Good day from the Corning Museum of Glass. We're in the studio across the parking lot from the main building, and we're in the middle of our winter classes. So we have a lot of people around who are taking classes in casting with Richard Whiteley, color theory with Mark Matthews, and so on. It's really busy here right now. And it's been a busy week for me, particularly because I'm teaching a class in an introduction to the Venetian style of glass blowing. And also at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, my third ebook was released. It's called The Techniques of Roman Glassblowing. And it's free. It's always on the web. It's on the Corning Museum of Glass website. You can also just enter romanglassblowing.cmog.org and that'll magically take you there. It's the third of my ebooks, and there are words, a lot of good photographs of museum objects from various collections, and above all, videos. And the videos are my reconstructions of how I think things were made in ye olde days. And I'm very comfortable with Renaissance Venetian techniques. I've done probably 40 years of research on that. My first two ebooks were about that. The first one was The Techniques of Renaissance Venetian Glass Working. Note the term working. And the second one was about the story of those Venetian glassblowers who escaped Murano, set up shop all over Europe, and established Venetian-style glassblowing. And many of them flourished, did really well. And this combination of books, I think, pretty much covers that subject. Well, beginning probably in 1980, I got really interested in Roman glass as well. And so that's the subject for this book. And it has 33 new videos in it. And it deals with glass blowing. Note the technique's title is glass blowing. There are a lot of other ways of shaping glass other than blowing. And in fact, in the history of glass, we're at about the midpoint. There's almost as much history pre-blown than we've experienced since glass blowing appeared in the late 1st century BC. So this is about glass blowing. I'm not dealing with casting, with various kiln working processes, cold working, flame working. A lot of different things happen in Roman glass studios, but I'm only dealing with glass blowing. And it's really interesting, I think, because they were the first glass blowers. Glass blowing started about 40-ish BC, and it spreads throughout the Roman world by the middle of the 1st century AD, let's say. And glass blowing is a fundamental part of that. But first, let's look at the big picture. I think it's always fun to consider things sort of globally. And let's just consider the material for just a minute. Glass is this curious material that when you heat it, it doesn't liquefy. For a practical glass person, I always think it's a bad idea to talk about the melting point. That's really gives a misconception. Metals melt. Here's a lead tin alloy solder. When you heat it, it suddenly goes from a solid to a liquid. Boom. Phase change, solid to a liquid. When you heat glass, it gradually, as it heats, loses its resistance to flow. So even gravity is enough to distort the glass. So there's gravity distorting it. And another thing the glass is at this point is it's infinitely stretchable. You can stretch glass as long as it's above like 1100 degrees for common glasses. And glass blowing is just another way of stretching glass. When you heat a piece of glass, The edge is getting hot first. Surface tension is causing the edge to try to occupy less volume, and it closes the tube. And this is stretching glass with, pneumatic force. So that's just exactly like taking a pair of tweezers and pulling on the glass. This is stretching glass. That's stretching glass. And those are the basic characteristics that make glass blowing possible. There's one other, and that is that glass is a very poor conductor of heat. It's essential that the glass be a poor conductor of heat. If it were an efficient conductor of heat like metal, it would lose its shape as it blew out thinner. Anyway, that's just a little bit about the basics of glass. And by the way, there are two kinds of glass on the planet. There's glass like obsidian, and there is glass that humans make, people make. This is old Steuben glass, very, very high quality crystal. And just as there are two kinds of glass, there are two basic categories of shaping a piece of glass, natural or made by people. One is cold working, and you can chip the glass to create shape. You can grind it. This is sandstone. You can sort of whittle it just like you would wood. Nowadays we use diamond pads. But if you do that long enough, you wear the glass away, and that's cold working. And there are basically two ways I think that the Romans did hot working. They did kiln working, and those kind of processes took place at relatively low temperatures, like Fahrenheit 1200, 1300, 1400. And there was glass blowing, and those processes took place at higher temperatures. And so we're going to look at glass blowing. The thing is, of course, you can handle glass just like, you can treat glass just like bronze or iron. I'm going to gather a little glass. And I'm going to dribble it into this open-faced mold. And I press the glass into the mold. And this was probably the first hot working technique. It's open-faced mold pressing. The many, many surviving little goddess Astarte glass figurines were made this way. So you can treat glass like a metal and cast it or press it, but glass blowing is probably the technique, the process that exploits the natural tendencies, the natural qualities of glass best. Let's see. Marco, could I ask you to soften that and try to make it a little prettier shape? Thanks. Anyway, glass blowing. There are two categories of glass blowing. I'm saying there are two categories of a lot of different things, right? Natural glass, glass made by people, hot working, cold working. Well, in terms of glass blowing, there are two categories. There's free blowing for making things like this, and these are processes whereby the glass blower uses the simplest tools, gravity, centripetal force to make something. And the most common thing that survives from the Roman world are long neck bottles made by glass blowing. So let me show you how one of those is made. gather a little bit of glass on the end of the blowpipe. I marver it so that it's cylindrical in shape. Then I blow a bubble. Elongate the bubble. And the bubble is now forming a tube. It's thin-walled. The tube cools quickly. The thick glass on the bottom stays hot and soft. And now I blow. And it inflates the vessel body. Now I need a constriction so that this will break off the blowpipe easily. It's a vessel, so I need to flatten the bottom. Now I need to hold it from the bottom to finish the rim. And this is one way. God almighty. I simply transfer it back onto the glass left on the blowpipe. We have a lot of Roman vessels that survive with what most call a ring-type punty mark, and that's indicative of this process. Now I've got the vessel held from the base, I'm reheating the opening, and I can make the opening most any shape I want. And this, by the way, is called a furnace-finished rim. Now that leaves the characteristic ring-shaped punty mark. A couple of other ways to hold vessels from the bottom. I'm going to make another bottle, and I'll break it off the blowpipe, and I'll need to finish the rim. This time I'll hold it with a device, a little simple clamp that will not leave a mark on the bottom. There's the bubble. I'll elongate that to form a tube. If it gets too long too soon, I just rub it on the floor. Sometimes in early Roman blown vessels, you see a tool mark area between the tube and the vessel body. And that comes from the use of the jacks. To make a sharper articulation between the vessel and the neck. So I'm going to heat the bottom, flatten the bottom. And again, this is a way of making a vessel without leaving a punty mark, yet having a furnace-finished rim. Now again, I have the problem, I have to hold the thing from the bottom to reheat the edge and finish it. So, this is an alternative technique. This is a modern clamp that is used typically by flame workers. I think it's called magic fingers. hot fingers. That's what it is. Magic fingers is the mattress that vibrates or something in old hotel rooms. So occasionally I have to flash this to keep the clamp hot and the vessel hot. Romans loved, from the very beginning of glassblowing, loved folding the glass. First thing is the folded edge, the double thickness folded rim or folded edge. So I just used a conical tool to push the rim upward and inward. And this produces what English people call an inverted rim or a folded rim. Now you may have noticed that in that business of flashing to keep everything hot, the squeeze made dents in here. And in a few Roman vessels I've handled, indeed you find those dents, particularly on square bottles. I show this in my ebook. Anyway, this is a simple bottle. The neck has been made a little more sharply articulated from the vessel body with a little bit of constriction. That's very common in Roman vessels. It's got an inner folded rim, and it has a furnace finished rim with no punty mark. It sounds like a lot of sort of not so important details, but when one's trying to determine whether something is really Roman or whether it's a fake, it's very useful to know all of these characteristics. So, no punty mark. It's been held with a clamp. Okay? So that's free blowing. Mold blowing, we think, starts around, and to be thorough, full-size mold blowing. It's the best term for that. We think it starts in the first decades of the 1st century AD. This is a beautiful terracotta blow mold made by a good friend in England, David Hill, who with his partner Mark Taylor, the Georgian glassmakers they call themselves now, know more about mold blowing of Roman period glass than anybody has since Rome, I'm sure. This is a mold made by David. It's terracotta. It's lined with soot so that the glass is less likely to stick to it. And I'm going to ask one of my students, Jose, to come up and hold this, and I'm going to lower, you can go in there, and I'm going to ask Jose to hold this, and I'm going to lower a bubble into it. And again, this is 1st century, sometime in the first decades of the 1st century, the famous Ennion used this very technology. So I'm going to gather a little glass, blow a little bubble, and lower that into the mold. I'm going to use the blow hose so that we can do this up at eye level. I gather the glass, marver it, there's the bubble. Now I'm going to let this elongate a bit. And you can close. And release. Open. Thank you, sir. And there's the final geometry, the final shape of the object, and the decoration. And that took, what, 45 seconds to make? Now at this point, you can have a seat, sir. Thank you. At this point, I could break this off the blowpipe, hold it from the bottom, do a furnace finished rim, just like you've seen twice. Or I could use some different technology to create a rim, and that's called a cracked off rim. And this occurs just about when this appears in Roman glassblowing. The cracked off rim is certainly present by about 10, 20, 30 AD. So I'm going to show you that. It's very different. The object is cooled, it's annealed. Let me show you what a cracked off rim looks like. First, a furnace finished rim is smooth. It might have a folded edge. It might not, but it's always smooth, always has tool marks near the edge. It's very strong. You practically can't break a furnace finished rim. By contrast, and sharp contrast, a cracked off rim has a very mechanical look to it. This just broke accidentally, but this is a gladiator cup, a fragment of a gladiator cup that is made from a mold made by David Hill, and this is the cracked off rim. When it came out of the mold, it was attached to the blowpipe and it looked like that. And so after it was annealed, I made a scratch, put it on a turntable, and heated that spot of the circumference with a little torch, and it pops off. The expansion of the glass at the surface propagates a crack started at the scratch, and it goes around, usually pretty much all the way around. Here's another example. So this is something probably from the 1st century. This is something from 300 or 400 years later. This is a very interesting, pretty recent acquisition of the museums, the Corning museums, and it's got a cracked off rim too. So cracking off, once it appears, is used pretty much uninterruptedly. So with the cracked off rim, it looks like this. This is the finished object. And by the way, typically cracking off doesn't go always back to the spot where it started, and it typically has a little step down right there. And this edge is extremely sharp, and it has to be smoothed immediately. So that's a cracked off rim. Now, furnace opening a rim requires the glassblower's maximum skill. That's probably the hardest thing in the process. Cracking off requires essentially no skill. It requires a couple of specialized tools. But you don't have to have any particular skill to do it. And every Riedel glass, every Baccarat glass, any wine glass or champagne glass you buy from Pottery Barn or whatever, Conran's, if that still exists, all those glasses have cracked off rims. The only time you encounter furnace finished rims is really these days in studio glass. And the most old-fashioned glass blowers in Venice do the furnace finished rim. That's because it's so difficult. It takes so much time. It's done at the end of the process. So if you mess it up, you've lost all that time working. Anyway, I'm going to attempt to demonstrate cracking off for you. Now recently, probably 6 months ago, I'll take it, I had a genuine discovery by accident, but it was a discovery. The question is, how do you crack off the excess glass? In modern times, you make a scratch with a torch. You heat the circumference. Well, torches are a 20th century, that sort of torch is a 20th century invention. They probably didn't use flame working to do that. So I came up with this hot conical cone, and this is a typical object with a rim that needs to be, with an upper part that needs to be cracked off. Here's another one. And I found purely by accident this process. So let me try to demonstrate it. The problem with cracking off, especially when you're showing someone the process, it knows you want it to work. So what's going to happen with this is I'm going to scratch this thing in this hot cone, and the combination of scratching and delivering the heat right where the scratch is may make a beautiful cracked off rim. That's too big. That's a little bit too big, too small. Get that hotter. So I've been making the conical tool out of glass because I'm a glass blower. Probably they were made of metal, I would guess. And I'll show you a couple of other reasons after I do this, if it works. If it doesn't work, we'll move on quickly. But if it works, I want to point out a couple of things to you. So I'm just going to make this a little bigger diameter. There we go. Now, here goes. So I'm just going to scrape this around inside here. And I always jump when it breaks. So don't be alarmed. There. Ta-da. Now, pretty much every time I immediately, just in case somebody picks one of these things up, I do that. That edge is as sharp as anything on the planet for a few minutes before the water, the moisture in the air, erodes the glass surface. And so that's a cracked off rim. Boy, I'm tempted to do that again, but it's probably not going to work. Anyway, that's a cracked off rim. Are there any questions about that? Any questions? Anything on the web?
Is there anything you can look at from an old piece to tell if it was cracked off that way, like are there any indicators?
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah. So the thing that's curious about the conical tool and the cracking off this way is that it does something that the scratch and the torch doesn't do. The cracked off edge is not perpendicular to the vertical axis, rather it's oblique. It's slightly conical. Dan, you want to show that? This upper edge is not flat, it's oblique, and the lower edge is always on the inside. Never fails. So I think it's pretty good evidence. If you do it the modern way, it's straight across. So I have to confess I'm madly in love with the hot conical tool, because I think that's really, I think a major realization of a Roman technique. Obviously, none of this stuff was written down. If it was handed down, it's 2,000 years later. So I reverse engineer. I look at things carefully and do things that reproduce what I see in the original objects. Okay, is that okay? Okay, so that's a cracked off rim. So just to summarize, we got free blowing and full-size mold blowing. We've got furnace finished rims and cracked off rims. Now, one of the fundamental problems in glass blowing that the first glass blowers had to solve was this. How do you get the hardened hot glass off the blowpipe? Let me just show you what I mean. Plenty of people could have done this. You know, people were making glass for literally 1,000 years before glass blowing comes around, more than 1,000 years, and somebody could have taken a hollow tool with some glass on the end and blown in the other. And this is what they'd get. This is all well and good, but how are you going to use this? To me, the number one challenge in glass blowing is how do you get the hardened hot glass off the blowpipe, right? If we just let it cool to room temperature, the glass and the metal have a really different coefficient of expansion, they crack apart. So if you just let it cool, they'll crack apart. You have to somehow get it off the blowpipe. And I think this was, the first thing that made glass blowing practical and possible was solving that problem. And I think they did it by consistently forming a tube between the blowpipe and the vessel body. Think of the long neck bottle. Narrow glass tubing breaks pretty easily and pretty cleanly. So if you can create a tube of glass between the thing you're making and the blowpipe, it'll break pretty easily. Now, I made two Roman bottles, and you saw that. Some objects that survive, this is an example, this is a vestige of the tubular neck. This has no vestige of it. What about something like a bowl like this? It has a typical Roman foot and a folded edge. Why do I think that there might have been a tube between the bubble and the blowpipe? It's because to get a big folded rim like this, you have to have a lot of material, and it's best if it's in the form of a tube. So I'm going to show you one of those bowls, and I'm going to do it with a pretty big amount of glass. I'm going to gather from the main furnace, the 1,000-pound furnace. And because I want quite a bit of glass, I'm going to do what I call a coating gather, let it cool a little bit, and I'm going to gather on top of that more glass. And that is a quick way of getting a lot of glass on the end of the blowpipe. This is just to cool the pipe so that it's possible for me to put my hand down close to the glass. Now, we don't know whether Romans used marvers. We don't know whether they used relatively modern, like 16th century, wood blocks to initially shape the glass. So here I'll use the wood block. And this is going to be a bowl with a Roman foot, another folding technique, and an outer folded edge. That Roman bottle had an inner folded edge, and this will be a gigantic outer folded edge. Something that's really important in glass blowing when a punty is attached to hold the vessel from the bottom to form the rim, something that's really important is to have a thick spot on the bottom for the punty to sit on. So I marver the tip pointed. Marver again. Now here's where the tubular neck comes in. I'm going to make a constriction and pull out. And here comes the tube. I make a tighter constriction where it can break cleanly. I'm going to reheat it and blow it a little bigger. And now the Roman foot. That was just to stiffen up the upper half. Going to heat the lower half of the bubble and make it conical, make it a conical shape. This is the beginning of the Roman foot. And again, I'm going to use the blow hose here in place of an assistant blowing and sucking in when I ask for help. I finish the conical shape, flatten the bottom, and I'm going to reheat the lower, half inch or so. Flatten a blade on either side. I hold the friction and I can bend the foot downward if I want. If I want a cylindrical shaped foot, I just force it downward at the edge. Now I'm going to reheat the entire bubble and reshape it. This is going to be a low bowl. And to make a low bowl, I need the bubble, this bubble, to be the shape of an oblate spheroid. Punty goes in. Bottom for the punty to sit on. I'm going to force cool it. And this is the most common kind of punty. A little bit of hot glass on the end of a metal rod. I blow on it just before I put it on so that it won't stick too much. At the constriction, I chill the narrowest part and it breaks free of the blowpipe. Next step is the outer fold, this big outer fold. And experimentally, I've found that if I don't have this tube, I can't make the fold nearly as big as the originals. So this is my evidence for the presence of the tube. Now these reheats may seem kind of long to you. The glass is very thin, it cools very quickly. Through the good graces of David Hill and Mark Taylor, these friends of mine in Andover, England, I've had the opportunity over the years to work many times at wood-fired furnaces. The reheats at a wood-fired furnace are markedly longer because the heat is much more gentle. It's not necessarily temperature, but the heat is mostly delivered to the work by radiant transfer, and it simply takes longer to get the glass hot. So I just reinforce the tubular shape of that uppermost part. And what I'm going to do is go in with the jacks and lift and rotate the angle so that the rim moves outward, gets bigger, and eventually I'll push the rim against the shoulder of the vessel. There's the outer fold. Outer folds always trap air. It is just making sure before I open it. Yeah, Roman feet always have a trap of air around them, and folded edges always have a trap of air. Maybe 0.5% don't. And now I begin to give it its final shape. This is wax that lubricates the jacks against the glass. These Roman techniques can produce a really amazing variety of shapes, forms that can look like they're from all different periods. This right now looks like, Vienna 1900, Wiener Werkstatt. But the bowl I'm imitating in the collection at the museum is slightly conical and has a slightly flared edge. So I'm going to do that right now. And here is the flared edge. So that's the bowl, tubular, tight Roman foot, big outer folded lip in a bowl that could be from the 1st century, 2nd or 3rd centuries. Very hard to date things like this because they're so generic. And that goes into the annealing oven and leaves the characteristic scar on the bottom called the punty mark, or pontal mark, punty, pontal, same thing. Are there any questions so far?
So Teresa on the live stream wants to know what other remaining mysteries there are in Roman-period glassblowing.
What remaining what? Oh, mysteries. Oh yeah, the question is remaining mysteries. What is yet to be solved in these Roman glass blowing techniques? There are quite a few things. There is a lot of work to be done. In my book, in the ebook, I show a technique called snake thread. And snake thread is a very fine decoration that's applied on all sorts of vessels. And I worked on it for years and years with no success. And about a year ago, I started rethinking it, and I had some pretty good success, and I show you that in the ebook. And I'm happy with that. It requires an assistant. It is done at the furnace. I will say that there are two types of snake thread decoration. The dribbly type is what I show in the book. There's another type which is much finer, and I believe that those elements were made by flame working, and then they were preheated and laid on the surface of the vessel, probably when it was not fully blown out. Anyway, the dribbly kind of snake threading, I feel pretty good about its having been dribbled on, and the moment the glass touches the vessel, someone comes along with a little roulade, a little tool with grooves in it, and impresses the thing with these embossing lines. So in that case, it requires two assistants. The business of the cracking off, I think that I feel pretty good about this as a cracking off method. I'll continue to pursue that, but that's been something that's bothered me for years. And there are all sorts of details. This is one of the very first stemmed wine glasses. This is my replica. It's not the original. Anyway, this is one of the very first stemmed wine glasses, and it's a fascinating solution to the problem of how do you create a stem and a foot on a glass. It's what we call a one-piece glass. One bubble is constricted near the end to form the stem, and a bubble hanging off the end of that stem is flattened, and that forms the foot. There is an opening, and if you put liquid in it, the liquid gets in there, and it becomes what a lot of glassblowers call a ptomaine trap. So you get ptomaine poisoning if you use it too much. Anyway, the one-piece glasses are a fascinating challenge. And later Roman glassblowing, like we see in objects like this, 4th, 5th century Roman glassblowing, are all built on the foundation of these fundamentals that I just showed you. They're just variations of that. And in the ebook, the first section, it's divided into chapters, and the first chapter is about various aspects of the quality of the material, the behavior of the material, and basic things. Chapter 2 is called long-necked bottles, and it's the great variety of long-necked bottles and the various decorations people put on them and so forth. Chapter 3 is objects based on the long-necked bottle process, and that includes just some wacky stuff like a bird in the shape, a vessel in the shape of a bird, all sorts of interesting things. A vessel in the shape of a mouse, a vessel in the shape of a fish, one in the shape of a Roman gladiator helmet. So those are just showing that using these basic techniques, and those are at the latest 3rd and 4th century objects. Just by then, they had, with their creativity, come up with all these amazing variations. And then the other chapters, one chapter is cups and goblets, one chapter is bowls and dishes. The last chapter is, I think, particularly interesting. It's compound objects. And at some point in the 1st century, someone realized that 2 teams of glassblowers, or 2 glassblowers, could blow bubbles, heat their tips, and stick them together, and thereby make compound objects. You know, a small bubble could be used as a foot, the larger bubble for the vessel. And that's the beginning of compound objects made by glassblowing. And that was the thing that was so fully realized in the Renaissance by the Venetians. And if you go to the first ebook, Techniques of Renaissance Venetian Glassblowing, you see just countless variations of stacking bubbles together to make things. But that starts in the early 1st century, and I show that in the last chapter. Are there any other questions?
Another one on
Yeah, please.
how would Roman period glassblowers, how would they have annealed their objects back in the day?
How would Roman period glassblowers how would they have annealed their objects? It's a more interesting question than you might think, in that, in my experience at wood-fired furnaces, I've seen firsthand that the managing of the temperature of the furnace is pretty straightforward. You can see if it's too bright, it's too hot. If it's too dull, sort of reddish, it's too cool. So the stoker, the person in charge of feeding the furnace, the dry hardwood that it consumes by the, not bushel, what's that unit? The cord. They feed the furnace according to the need to keep the temperature at about Fahrenheit 1975 or so, maybe approaching 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's pretty straightforward. Well, if you don't already know it, every hot working process, after it's broken free of the puntee, has to be cooled slowly. That's called annealing. If the thin parts cool too quickly, the thick parts cool slowly, the thin parts contract and they pull away from the thick parts and they crack. And so the vessel will wind up cracking. So you have to cool it slowly with this process of annealing. And something like this could be annealed in a couple of hours. It's not like it takes days to cool it down. If it's thin, it can be annealed relatively quickly. Anyway, the annealing oven has to be kept at roughly, for this glass, let's say, roughly 900 Fahrenheit. Well, 900 Fahrenheit inconveniently looks exactly like 72 degrees Fahrenheit. You can't tell the difference. There is no visual cue that tells you the temperature of the oven. Furnace, no problem. Annealing oven, it's a mystery. So, it's particularly important that one has a skilled stoker. I must confess that most of us who've worked at wood-fired furnaces in the last 10 or 15 years use a thermocouple, an electric temperature sensor, but presumably in earlier days there were intuitive ways to assess the temperature. When I first started going to Murano in the late 70s, early 80s, annealing ovens consisted of just a box of bricks with a big open yellow flame at one end, and there was always one person who managed the annealer. They had a title, the forcellante. They had a fork that they would move the work around in. Anyway, this was a very important job because if the work got too hot, it would slump. They'd wreck the work. If it didn't anneal properly, the work would crack. Very important job. And so the forcellante had under the annealers a stack of newspapers, and they would take a piece of newspaper, roll it up, open the door, throw it in, and count seconds until it burst into flame. And when it burst into flame, that would tell them how hot it was. Isn't that interesting? So that's one way of assessing the temperature. You know, people who make candy, the temperatures for making candy are very, very critical. And there are tests that you use a glass of water, cold water, and you dribble the hot liquid into it, and whether it makes a soft ball or a hard ball in a certain amount of time, that tells you what the temperature is. This is before thermometers that would go up to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. So there are all sorts of ways to do this. Any other questions?
Yeah. Someone said that in the YouTube videos that we've been posting, like leading up to the ebook, I noticed that Bill uses shears to trim the handle bit. Do we have any evidence on how this was done in Roman glass? Did the Romans use shears?
Yeah, the question is, did the Romans use shears? Someone has seen videos of me making, I guess, the Roman bottle with the handle. Let me just set up a quick Roman bottle. These bottles survive by the thousands in private and public collections. They must have been made by the hundreds of thousands. You know, it was in the Roman period, the early years of the first century, that glass, for the first time in history, became affordable by anyone. Prior to that, glass was a luxury material. So things like these bottles must have been made by the hundreds of thousands. There's the tube. The tube is hardened. I blow again. There's the vessel body. I'll make a tighter constriction near the blowpipe. Flatten the bottom. And I'm going to quickly flip this around. Punty it on its moil. This, by the way, is the only obligatory, unavoidable reheat in glass blowing. After the vessel's been transferred to the blowpipe, to the punty, you have to reheat the opening to shape the furnace glass blowing if you're going to have a furnace finished rim. Anyway, onto the handle. Roman handles are almost never round in cross section. They're usually flat. So here's the first attachment point. Now I'm going to use the shears to cut this free of the gathering iron. Attachment point is made, and then excess glass, thin thread along the larger, thicker, hotter part of the handle. That's called casting off. So the question was a very specific question. I have a theory as to who asked it. If you didn't have shears, how would you get this off to then be able to do that move? Well, what you do, I can't do it alone, I need an assistant. You put the handle on the initial point, the initial contact point, you turn it over, and with the pincers you push it on for the second one, and then you pull it off. It works fine. So you can do it fine without shears. Shears are convenient for me, so I do it that way, but it's entirely possible to do it without shears. Any last questions? Okay. Well, thank you for your patience, and I hope this has helped. Remember, it's called romanglassblowing.cmog.org. Just go to the Corning Museum of Glass website and you can find it. And if you have any questions, I'll be over the next few weeks looking closely at the Q&A section. So thank you all for watching and have a good day. Appreciate it.